Today I'm speaking with Gloria Froese. Gloria, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It's great to get to know you. And for a quick bio here, Gloria is from Steinbach, Manitoba, Canada, but she currently lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba with her husband and two young children. She was a member of the Church of God Restoration, which honestly, I don't know the first thing about. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your story and just who they are. It sounds like it's going to be quite a ride, though. She earned her bachelor's in fine arts from Providence College and Theological Seminary, and her favorite hobby is choral singing. So that's what I know about you so far. But could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and any other hobbies or pastimes you want to add?
Well, I love baking sourdough bread and experimenting with different things with that. So that's kind of a quirky little thing about me. Otherwise, life is busy with two young kids. They're 7 and 10. So activities, school, yeah, just a lot of busyness in general. And yeah, I'm disabled, so no longer able to work, but I do spend time with my friends and family and yeah, keep myself busy as far as that goes.
Hmm. With the sourdough, do you do the razor blade cuts that are real
I
fancy?
try. It's tough, but yeah, I do some of that. It's not as pretty necessarily, but yeah,
Hmm. That is such an art. I've seen some of those videos. It's amazing what some people can do.
it's really cool. It's one of the more satisfying things. I've done a lot of yeast bread baking, but there's something different about sourdough.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's really
that's very
cool.
cool. Very cool. Well, with that being said, I'm so glad you're here. We just love to hear people's stories. So if you could, take us back to the earliest days, how did your worldview get shaped?
Well, I was born into the Church of God, which for some history there, I guess, in back in 1880, a guy named Daniel Sidney Warner decided that he was going to start his own church. And he had a weird set of doctrines, some of them being living a holy life, divine healing of the body, being separate from the world. And I guess the main message was come out from among her, my people. And so formed the Church of God in that way. And fast forward a bunch of years, and this also went over to Germany. My grandparents were born in Germany and lived through the Second World War. And I guess after the Second World War, they found this Church of God during a time of revival or awakening or whatever was happening post war. And then they ended up moving over to Canada, and they and a bunch of other families formed a Church of God here. And so that is where my parents met and where I was born into. My dad was a pastor. And yeah, it was a fairly, I wouldn't call it necessarily a mainstream church, but it wasn't extremist by any means. It's still, I think the living a sin free life was taught. The divine healing was not taught. We went to doctors. I had all my childhood vaccines. Everything was, as far as that went. We had maybe more extremist views than some religions, but or some churches, but it wasn't that drastic. And dressed fairly normally. In church, we had to wear dresses, but otherwise, I could wear shorts, short sleeves. It was a normal ish childhood, really. I went to public school, and this was in the 80s, which is when the homeschooling movement was really getting started. And I guess my parents had always had more of a bent towards extremism and wanting more ideological purity. And I have a picture of them even when they were in their 20s of standing at D.S. Warner's grave and just wanting, like, back to the good old days, the way things were, the purity of the Church of God. And again, the doctrines are pretty wacky. So again, the divine healing, the living a sin-free life, like, not practical in any way, but I guess this appealed to people with the ideological purity. And so they just yeah, I guess the homeschooling movement appealed to them because it was about perfection. You could have these perfect kids, bypass all the dangers of the world.
Yep.
And then there was also conflict that was happening in the church at that point. So when I was about 8, I started noticing tension. My dad was the pastor, and I noticed tension between him and some of the parishioners. And yeah, I think it was when I was 8 that my parents finally decided they were done. The church had wanted to transfer them to a different congregation. They opted not to and left the church entirely. So we left the parsonage we were living in. They bought a place out in the country, and I finished my grade 3 school year, and we moved out to the country. And then I was informed that I was no longer going to be going to school after this. I would be homeschooled, which I was a really outgoing, gregarious child, and I loved school, and I was pretty distressed about it, but I mean, as a what was I, 8-year-old? What could I say about that, really? And yeah, so we left the church, so that was my friends there, left the school, that was all my friends there, so I basically had no friends, we had nobody to hang out with. Living out in the country, we weren't in town that often. So I basically went from having an active social life to having nothing. And so we were isolated for maybe about a year or so. And then old friends from the Church of God that we had been in, they called and told my parents that they had found this wonderful new Church of God group where the Lord is restoring things to where it should be and the way it had been. And it's so glorious, and they're on fire and they're alive and it's amazing. And I remember the one phone call where they were having a meeting. It was in Elmer, Ontario, and they had a whole bunch of people there, and they sang a song over the phone, and it was a cappella harmony, and it was exciting and so different. I loved the music of my childhood. I still have a fond place in my heart for it, but it was very German and very structured, which I appreciate structure very much now, especially after what happened in the ensuing years. But I guess this was new and different and exciting, and it was spontaneous a cappella music, and yeah, it sounded amazing, and so my parents got hooked, and we were invited to the camp meeting in Ohio that year, and this was back in 1991. So we drove down there, and I remember arriving on the campground and just looking. I had no idea what I was coming into, what to expect. I think I knew by this point that they dressed modestly. Didn't know any details, so really I had no clue. So we were looking around, and suddenly a bunch of people came out, and the women were wearing long dresses, everybody had long sleeves. Women had their hair up in buns. Girls had braids. Very, very different from what I was used to, very unusual, but the people were warm and lovely, and they welcomed us and love bombed us. Now I know that's what it was, and pulled us into the meeting. And the services were different from what I'd known. Again, I'd grown up with German, was quiet, orderly, structured, nothing out of place. And here people were yelling and shouting and raising their hands and jumping and running down the aisles. And okay, that was weird, but all right. And so I was still trying to acclimate to all of that, getting to know the different kids my age, which it was different, all very different from what I had known. And the services were weird, and the messages were unendingly long. I remember that being torture. And then my mom started pressuring me, and she said, "You need to go down to the altar and pray." And again, in the church of my childhood, we would have where we would go down to the altar. So you would go up to the front and pray. But that was only if you were going to be getting saved or under extreme circumstances. So otherwise, if you needed to pray or talk with somebody, you did that in private in your own time, basically. But here, the culture was that after every sermon, they would sing an altar call song, so a slower, more emotional song, and people would come down and kneel at the altar, and somebody would come and pray with them. And so my mom started pressuring me, and she's like, "You should go down. Those sisters are so wonderful to pray with." I'm like, "Yeah." But I did, but I'm already saved. So, in the church of my childhood, I had got saved when I was 5. I had gone down to the altar, and somebody had prayed with me. And I had got saved, so whatever that means. And so for me, as far as I was concerned, that was dealt with. But no, now the pressure was building, and I don't think she was questioning my salvation yet at this point. And again, this is a 9-year-old child this is happening to. I look at my kids and just in context, it makes no sense. But then it was serious. And so I resisted. I'm like, no, I'm not going down there in front of everybody to pray because I am already saved and I don't need anything. So I held out that meeting, and after that, I was told that I was going to be wearing long sleeves all the time. So I remember being in the car, getting ready to drive home, and my travel dress had short sleeves. And some of the girls that I'd been friends with came to say goodbye to me, and they started laughing at me. And I'm like, "What? You're wearing short sleeves." I'm like, "Okay." So that was that. And I struggled with it. And I remember actually talking to the leader of this group. I'll come back to him in a minute. He deserves a little section of history himself. But talking to him and asking, "So, can I not wear pants or shorts even at home ever? Like if I'm climbing trees or if I'm doing something else?" And he's like, "Put it this way. What if you are wearing pants at home and a carload of saints, which is what we called each other, drives up the driveway and sees you wearing pants? So no, you can't." So never ever could I wear pants again. To give some history on the leader of the group, this is kind of important for the context of it. His name was Daniel Lane, and he was also raised in a different branch of the Church of God, also a more liberal one. And he got into drugs when he was in his late teens, I believe, and left home when he was 18 and went to the streets of San Francisco and ended up doing, I think it was cocaine. And he was a sex worker on the streets of San Francisco. And I think he did that for about 20 years. And then he said that God called him. God spoke to him. He's like, "I will save you. I will make all this go away," basically. So yeah, he would have been in his late 30s at that point, and I guess he just walked away from the streets and got gloriously saved and joined a more conservative Church of God, where they were more on fire than what he had been raised in. And I really feel like I need to do a history thing on the different branches of Churches of God for this to make sense. But for the weird, quirky culture of the Church of God, what makes it really interesting, though, was so they had started in the late 1800s, and then the founder died, and some of the others took it on from there. And then in the early 1900s, they had a massive church-wide split over the very important theological issue of the necktie. So the largest part of it broke away and formed Anderson Church of God. So if you know Bill and Gloria Gaither, they're from that branch.
Yeah.
It's a large, and again, most of it is pretty much mainstream religion by now. And then the smaller part broke away and became what we called Faith and Victory. And their headquarters were in Guthrie, Oklahoma. And they kept on with the legalistic dress, not wearing neckties. And they carried the doctrine of divine healing more rigidly, so they wouldn't go to the. I think even some of them still don't go and get medical help at this point. And so he had been born into the Anderson branch of the Church of God. And also the Church of God that I was born into was a branch off the Anderson Church of God as well. But meanwhile, the Faith and Victory was the more legalistic side. And so this is what Lane ended up going to when he came off the streets. He didn't go to the more mainstream church that his parents are a part of, but he went to the legalistic one. And even that wasn't harsh enough for him, even there. So he became a minister really quickly, and he was charismatic. He was good. Manipulative. I've never seen somebody so manipulative in my lifetime. He had the skills. So he started becoming an agitator, and things weren't good enough. And some of the older ministers of the Faith and Victory branch of the Church of God were starting to sound the alarm. They're like, something is wrong with this guy. This is not okay. He ended up breaking off, taking a whole bunch of families with him, causing massive chaos within the entire church movement, and built his own group. And that was in the late 1980s. So I came in the fairly early days of it. It was just really starting to get going.
I was going to add, when
And
you have an extremist group, like if there's a mainstream and there's an extreme group, and then there's an extreme group inside of it, it's like we need to start calling ourselves a cult at this point. You know, it's pretty obvious.
pretty much, yeah. And
Crazy.
I think the Faith and Victory branch was calling them a cult already. Like they got the label pretty early on. I remember even extended family they were super distressed about what we were getting into. My grandparents, other relations, they were really upset. They begged my parents not to. There was a lot of conflict because of that. Because of all the phone calls my parents were getting. And what I've since learned is that when somebody has decided that they're going to join a group like this, once they've made up their mind, there's no point in arguing with them because nothing you say is going to change their mind. So now when I encounter people like that, when they start saying the things that my parents would have been saying then, I'm like, well, good for you. Hope it works out for you. Just remember there's an exit if you need it, but I'm not going to try to talk you out of this. Because yeah, it's, I guess once you've drunk the Kool-Aid, once you've fallen under that spell, it's too late.
Yeah, that's so sad. It's a horrible dynamic. I was just recently talking about that idea of like on the other side, like once you've escaped or where you can't unsee what you've seen, you can't really go back. But it's also true on the other side of it where it's like if you just know that you know that you know that you've got the one pure truth and the one best way of living, which I went to a school called Bob Jones University, which if you're familiar with, it says some similar
Uh-huh.
traits. You just feel like you're living the best life ever, and everyone else is kind of
Mhm.
um what I say. There's too worldly. They're letting the world into their as opposed to the purity, and it's like the Bible's really clear about having purity in your gospel and in your life. And if you take that to the nth degree, it's like you do eventually have to get to that what they used to call even second degree separation, where you're not just separating from the bad people, you're separating from the good people who hang out with the bad people ever, or who are unwilling to not hang out with the bad people in your mind, bad people in quotes.
Mhm.
And it's just once you get on that second and even third degree separation, it's just like, yeah, you're so far gone at that point.
It's a drug. It completely takes you over. And yeah, it must have been I've talked to family members since, and they've talked about how distressing it was to watch us go down this path, but they tried. There was nothing they could do. And I think they knew how hard it was going to be for me, especially for the kids. But again, what could you do at that point? So yeah, now we've gone home after the Ohio camp meeting. My parents have bought in hook, line, and sinker. This is the one true Church of God. This is the best place in the world. You are guaranteed to raise perfect kids with this. You are not going to have the heartbreak that you have out in the world. Also, we don't date. The Lord picks who you're going to marry. So you don't have the heartbreak of any of this kind of stuff. It's perfect, and you will have the most perfect life. And you will not have rebellious teenagers. And it's just like the path ahead looked so rosy and so glorious. And
Wow.
now it's 30 years since then, and I'm looking back at what's happening in the church and the amount of immorality and broken hearts and what they would call sexual impurity is unbelievable. So it's like, yeah, this was an experiment that was always doomed to fail badly. And it's just terrible to see the heartbreak of my generation and those younger than me. It's just, I can hardly handle it sometimes. So, but these were still the early glory days and everything sounded wonderful. And the homeschooling movement sounded wonderful. So not only was I was going to be homeschooled away from the evil influences of public school, and I was being kept away from all the other evil influences of everything. And the church was perfect and it was going to make our lives perfect. And everything was just going to be glorious. And we had the pure truth that nobody else had. And then the next meeting that was coming up was in Nooksack, Washington, which is just south of BC. And so we drove out there, and my mom's sister lived in BC, and we stayed with her before we went, and we were still heavily in the evangelizing stage of it. Like, look, we found the best thing ever. You have to come join. And my mom convinced her sister to come. And so my aunt and her family joined at that point as well at this meeting. And personally, at this point, the pressure is building on me to, you need to go down, you need to go and pray and get saved. And I'm like, but I am saved. It's like, yeah, well, maybe it didn't really take or something. At this point, I am 10. And
Wow.
I look at my 10-year-old, I'm like, what? None of this makes sense, but okay. So I kept on resisting because I'm a very stubborn person and I have my principles and I stick with them. And no, I am saved. Leave me alone. And the one thing this group was really good at is dialing up the emotion. At least they were. They are not anymore as much, but they were really good at manipulating emotion. And one night, one of the ministers got up and he preached about the blood of Christ. I don't think it was even about hell as much, but it was about look at how Christ suffered for you. And this message was aimed specifically at the children. Children being my age, some younger, maybe a few older, but aiming at like 6 to 10-year-olds, basically. A little bit of a sideline on this one. A few years later, that minister was discovered to have been molesting a bunch of teenage girls and having some weird fixations with them. So, no surprise there
Hmm.
to be preaching at children, but it just adds an extra level of grossness. But yeah, so I remember his snot would fly when he preached. He would just be wailing and weeping, and yeah. And he was wailing at the children to think of the blood of Christ flowing for you, and just the emotion. And then the altar call came and the songs, just the more and more emotional, and it was heavy. And my mom keeps on pressuring me. She's like, "You need to go down and pray. You need to go down and pray." And I'm like, "No, I'm good."
Can I ask you a
Keep
clarifying
on.
question on that?
Mhm.
What you know how some churches would do things differently enough that they might ask you to redo some part of it, like if say you were sprinkled as a child in a Presbyterian church and then you go to a Baptist church, they might say, well, even if you're a believer, you still should go through believer's baptism, where you're immersed and so forth. But there are also churches where their actual intense doctrine about the gospel is going to be different. Like where the Roman Catholic Church might be more about you need to go through these stages and be confirmed and so forth and do the liturgies. I don't know what they all would say is enough to get saved, but whatever their list is, and then you go to, of course, to more of an evangelical Protestant church. It's going to be very different. Just purely did you place your faith in Christ as your Lord and Savior? But were they was your mom encouraging you to be re-saved in the sense that that church was preaching a different kind of message in any way?
No, because the Church of God's premise is that every blood-washed member or every blood-washed Christian is a member of the Church of God. There's no actual membership. So if you are blood-washed and saved, you are automatically a member of the Church of God. So no, my experience should have translated.
So what, like a Baptist, say I come over as a Baptist and I'm like, I've never been in this church before, but I love the Lord Jesus Christ. I've been baptized. I'm
Welcome,
immediately
brother.
a part of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
If
Interesting.
they believe they have the discernment that they can feel this. And I've had some friends over the years test that. It's a few gay friends actually who went to visit, and they're just like, yeah, they talk the language. And they're like, "Oh, welcome, brother. We can feel that you've got the spirit. You are a brother." And I'm like, "You have no idea, do you?" So
Well,
they feel that they know. But yeah, if they feel that you are sincere enough, aka if you're able to act and say the right things, then you're good. You're in. So really my experience, because I was saved in a church of God, it should have translated. I'm not sure why she felt it didn't. I think she wanted me to buy into this more thoroughly. I'm not sure.
was there a lot of
Because at that
hellfire preaching?
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Like, was that possibly part of it? Just the sense of like, yes, she made a profession, but just in case we need a little fire insurance here.
Maybe. I'm not even sure because it really or maybe because I was a strong-willed child who would have talked back and protested and fought, I was maybe not living as obedient of a life as I was expected to. That could have been it. That she felt that I wasn't actually because again, you're supposed to be living a holy sin-free life. And so she might have felt I wasn't. I don't know. I don't know what the rationale was around that.
That's really interesting though to have
Mm.
that kind of pressure though as a kid, like you mentioned. It's kind of weird, but also it's very coercive in the sense of like if you don't even not from a family dynamic, just from a theological perspective, if somebody doesn't feel the pull, like you don't want to create an atmosphere and kind of make it happen. You don't want to schmooze someone into the kingdom. Like they want to bow their knee willingly to the church and to the Lord and to the Bible
Not
and the gospel,
here.
or you don't. It's like you don't want to have someone go through, just through the motions. It sounds like it was almost like just to go through the motions or something.
It's the motions, but it's actually worse. And just a little while ago, I tuned into one of their church services. I sometimes do that just to keep an eye on what's going on. And I heard a woman get up and testify that her, I think it was 10 or 11-year-old daughter, wasn't getting saved. And so what she decided to do, she was going to force her into it. So she would send good lunches with the rest of the kids to school. This kid only got bread. And at the supper table, everybody else gets to eat the good food. You don't. And so this kind of
Oh,
pressure,
gross.
that's full
That's
on
like,
abuse.
yeah, I was gonna say that we're into child abuse now. Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, I think CFS needs to hear about this, but yeah. So she said, "I this child wasn't taking her salvation seriously, so I, as her mother, had to step into the gap and do this." And so basically forced her by this, and who knows, if she was withholding food, she would have been doing other methods too, to coerce and force this child to get saved. And eventually, of course, the child had to cave and do it. But yeah,
Hmm.
it doesn't they don't want you to be drawn, like, you are going to join by hook or by crook. I have known they have beaten up kids who refuse to get saved. I remember there was a few boys who would be holding out back in my day, and they beat one of them so badly that he passed out, In one case, a bunch of men had to hold down the one boy. He would have been late teens at that point. Beat him so hard until he finally gave in. But it was gruesome. Like the stories that we heard were beyond gruesome.
Mm.
But they would force you, they would break you. And if you look at the videos and pictures of these kids now, you can see it in their eyes. You can see that they're broken. They have nothing anymore. So
Horrible.
this was the early days, so it was maybe not as explicit yet, but this is what you did. You made your children join by hook or crook. It didn't matter what the methods you used were. So really, in comparison, what was used on me was nothing. That was just pressure. And so this altar call is now going, and mom was pressuring me, and I'm like, nope, nope, nope. And finally, after I don't know how many songs, I'm like, fine, whatever. And I wasn't impervious to the emotional tone of it all, because again, the songs are just, and the wording of some of the songs, I sometimes pick some of them apart, and it's like lost forever, oh how sad, um just gruesome, like you're going to hell, they paint horrible pictures, and it's with emotional manipulative music, and so yeah, it gets to you. And I think I was also tired of just resisting. I just wanted this to be over. So I went down and I prayed, and the leader, Danny Lane, came down and prayed with me. And so I actually got the big guns for mine. um, and so there, I was saved. 10-year-old, I am saved. It's good. But the Church of God also teaches a second work of grace, which is sanctification, which is burning the root of sin out of your life so that you are no longer tempted to sin. So when Adam sinned, he caused the root of sin to be put into every person's heart afterwards. It's another one of the really wonky doctrines. And so when you pray for sanctification, for the Holy Spirit to come and fill you and to burn out all the root of sin, he will come and do that, and you will never be tempted to sin again. And so I did that about 2 days later. So now I'm saved and sanctified. And then 2 days later, I got baptized. So got all my 3 rituals done. I'm good. So now my testimony can be, I am saved and sanctified and in the true church of God.
Mm. That's
Again,
amazing.
10-year-old child.
With no real idea what you're signing up for.
None. Oh, but it was heady and it was glorious. And I remember we were staying in little plywood cabins. There was no insulation, nothing. And I remember it was at night. I don't know if I was singing or praying or something. And I remember the guy next door came and said the next day how wonderful it was just to hear me sing like this. Yeah. Everybody was always so thrilled when the kids would dedicate themselves, because now you've got the kids locked in.
And that's
Yeah.
sort of the other side of it, like the negative side of the abuse and the pressure, the coercion, but also the whole, like, look, if you do this, it's like,
You would be
you know,
loved and accepted,
yeah,
and it's glorious.
like
Yeah,
ice
the love
cream,
bomb.
fudge sundaes all day, when that happens, it's like, what kid's not going to want that? Especially if you see it, everyone else is getting a party. Why not me?
Yeah, exactly. And just there's celebrations when a sinner comes home or when somebody gets saved. Like I remember just sitting in the tabernacle or chapel or wherever we were, waiting for somebody to pray their way through. And sometimes it was big dramatic attempts where everybody was yelling and screaming and crying. And then finally the sun would break through and this person would be saved, and they would stand up and they're shouting gloriously, God saved them. And everybody is shouting and rejoicing and singing. And I forget some of the songs we sang, but it was just like this glorious party atmosphere afterwards. And it's all emotional manipulation. I still remember the feelings of it all, but it was heady and it was intense. And
Can I
yeah, it pulls people in. Yeah.
can I ask, on the personal side, despite the coercion, was there any sense in which you remember feeling like, God, I actually sense you there? Like, yes, this was coerced, but God, I sense you, or I can at least pray to you and feel like you're going to have my back. You're going to send a guardian angel or whatever. You're going to make a path for me where there's, unclarity. You'll make it clear. You'll open doors for me. Was there any sense of like he's with you, either in a generic guidance
Definitely.
sense or like you could just feel him?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was very real for me. Like I don't know if I could have put into words, but it was like the sun broke through for me at that point as well.
Okay.
And yeah, I now had God locked in. Everything was good. Yeah, I don't know if I would have put it in exactly those words, but yes, everything was wonderful now.
Now, are you at that kind of time frame? Would you be doing a lot of, what we would call devotions or quiet time? Were you doing a lot of things privately with the Lord too?
We all had to, yes.
Did that feel like a good experience, if you remember?
No, I never really was able to get myself into it, and it bothered me because they would preach messages about how you need to be praying for at least half an hour, and you need to, like, be down on your knees and praying out loud. I remember him actually preaching that parents, you need to go to your child's door when they're having devotions, and if you do not hear them praying for at least half an hour fervently, they are not right with the Lord. And this bugged me because for me, my relationship with God was more of a daily conversation. I would talk to him as I went. It wasn't a matter of, "Dear God, I thank you for such and such, and help me to fight this, and I pray for them." I would try. I would use all the fillers that I possibly can. So I had my watch and I'd look, okay, start. I would be, yeah, cover the thankfulness for what he's all done for me, cover all the prayer requests for all the people who need to be saved. And that list kept growing because people kept backsliding and leaving the church, and we needed those backsliders back. And praying for the unsaved relatives because everybody outside of us who wasn't joining the church was unsaved. Because once you are aware of the truth, by the way, and you don't join, you are no longer a Christian. So you might have been a
Mm.
Christian yesterday, but if I introduced you to the truth and you walked away from it, you are no longer saved.
Okay, so in their theology, you can lose it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh,
Okay,
absolutely.
so that's
You
a
lose it like
huge
this.
difference. Okay,
Oh, yeah. They decide that you can lose it.
wow.
They can actually I should send you some video clips of this, but they have outright said that they can take your salvation. So if I come up to you as I'm a minister and I come up to you and I'm like, "Brother Tim," or no, if I pull the title brother, then you know there's a problem. "Tim, I don't believe you are right with the Lord anymore. You have lost your salvation. That's it. You're done.
Hmm.
Go." And yeah, the whole brother and sister was so important there. It was we had anybody that we thought was a brother or sister, we would call that. And if I ever pulled that title, there was reason for you to fear. And I remember one of the girls actually came up to me at one point and was calling me Gloria. And I'm like, what have I done? What? It was terrifying.
Was it just an
But
accident, or did she really mean it intentionally?
I don't know. I never figured that out. I was never told that I had done anything. So I don't know, maybe in her head she decided I wasn't. It was deliberate. She said it several times.
Mm.
So I still don't know what. I know it's towards the end of my time there, there was a campaign to break me. So that might have been a part of it. I don't know.
Mm.
But yeah, so it was salvation is very conditional there. You can lose it. Again, if you commit one sin, you've lost your salvation. So you've got this whole ladder here. You've got salvation, sanctification, and then you climb the ladder. You commit one sin and you're back down to the bottom and you have to start from scratch. So this
Mm.
makes for people hiding anything that they consider a sin, or that wasn't a sin, that was a mistake. Mistakes are okay, sins are not. So you've got people doing horrific things, like there's full-on criminal acts happening there and, sexual abuses and whatever. They're not sins because, first of all, we're not gonna talk about them, and second of all, it's not a sin. It's yeah.
Mm.
But if it's somebody that they don't like, then they will absolutely pull it from them. So yeah.
It's
It
amazing that dynamic, because I've seen it too in my background on different, less intense levels. But you really end up in so many ways getting people to set up to a situation where they have to have a like a public face and then their real private life, and they
yeah.
just those cannot merge. Like you cannot know. And I've said this many times, so I won't belabor this point. But I remember, like at Bible college, the guys, I was in the pastoral program, so we're trying to be preachers, and soon, like we want to be preachers in the next year or two. And the Bible studies would all migrate to, how are you doing with masturbation? Have you stopped? And are you letting go of that awful sin? Or if you did, have you repented and are you going to recommit to stopping? And you're like, these guys are guys that if they admitted what they admitted in these the dorms with us in their men's Bible studies, if you admit this to the church that you're about to try to apply to be the pastor for in 2 years, they're going to think you're just like a complete fraud. And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like, but because you can keep it as separate, and especially if you can eventually get married and soon, so you now have this legitimate sexual outlet, and now it's like it's no big deal anymore because now you can have sex whenever you want to, technically, and so you're like, this guy's fine, like this is an okay path, and you end up for all those years of the frustration of sexual frustration, and then the whole, well, now that I'm married, I've kind of redeemed that bad background,
Mhm.
and it's all okay now. Eroticism's quite fine now, and now the facade that you were so ashamed of is now just swept under the carpet. And I mean, it's obviously from this side of deconversion. It's like that doesn't it's not something swept under the carpet. Like go masturbate, it's fine.
Yeah,
But at that point,
exactly.
you're thinking you're horrified at yourself, and
Mhm.
I remember thinking that many times, even as a Christian in the Bible college dynamic, thinking I can't believe how many people think we are like this high echelon of holiness. They have no idea. They have no idea.
Well, and it drives deviant behavior. Like, the amount of deviancy that happens in
Yes.
these kind of circles is, again, if the stories that I hear now that are happening in the church, it's unbelievable. I've never heard of that level of perversion in any other place ever.
Mm.
And I watch Law and Order SVU. So, it's really driven some horrible stuff. And this is what happens when you don't allow it. Because, yeah, coming back to the masturbation subject, I've had some of the guys tell me that they have masturbation calendars. And so they are each given either a minister or somebody higher up to be their accountability partner, and they have to catalog every time they masturbate, and go as far as to say who you were masturbating to, what were you fantasizing about, what were you looking at, give me all the details. And so I can come in and check in with you regularly. So what does your calendar look like? Show me your calendar. And so who were you thinking about this time? What were you doing this time? And some of the guys are like, yeah, I did that for a little bit. And then it's like, why am I doing this? Why do they care? Because these
Mm.
ministers wanted graphic details of what they were doing, which is just gag inducing.
It makes you think if they're looking for ideas to fantasize themselves, but even if they're not, it's like, yeah, that the craziness of such a like bizarre sexual fixation, and it makes me think, in a humorous sense, like I could see those guys, investing in some bottles of whiteout so they can kind of, after they've had to market, go back and white it out, and like, no, I haven't masturbated in 3 weeks, I'm fine. It's like, ugh, what a life.
It's horrible. And then I've heard from some that they actually wouldn't, like some of the really conscientious ones would. One even said that he had a wet dream because he didn't masturbate and he didn't do anything and he had a wet dream, and that was so horrifying to him that it was just, yeah, like the guilt that they live with is unbelievable. And they would say things like, yeah, if you wake up with a boner or you develop a hard on, you get on your knees and pray until it goes away. You don't
Yeah.
take hot showers. You don't, like, just the amount of legality and interference with such a normal bodily process is just,
Yeah. And I think
of
too, even
course
if you
it
don't
drives a
have,
kind
I'm sorry, go ahead.
sorry? Of course it drives the kind of deviancy that we are seeing now. Like, if you're doing, where do they think this is gonna lead?
Yeah.
You can't expect young men to not.
And even in the groups that are less hyper controlling on the outward side, they're still giving messages like I was never a part of a group that was that intense by any
Mhm.
stretch, but you still get the messaging, and you become your own self thought police, where you're just
Mhm.
like, I know I'm a bad person, and I hope nobody discovers what I'm really thinking. And it's just, and eventually it also, even if you're not really, even if you don't ever go towards deviancy, it really distorts the ability for you to enjoy being a human and your body. Like I remember growing up
Mm.
that, if I saw a woman's like blouse in church or in anywhere really, but
Mhm.
where it kind of like it slipped off, you could see her bra, especially if like it was like a fancy one, it was just lace on it or something. It was like, and my heart would literally race to see not even like not
A
down
bra
low, like
strap.
just up
Mm.
on the top. It'd make your heart race to think, oh my gosh, that's so off limits. And but I shouldn't look. But if no one's looking, and I can maybe look a second time, and it's like you put people in. It's not, you're not doing anything wrong in the deviant sense, but you just
Mhm.
you're
Hyper awareness.
yeah, hyper awareness, and you just feel so bad all the time because the minute that
Mhm.
you stop and the moment ends, you think, wow, I messed up. I must be uncommitted to the Lord, and I hope nobody saw me. And it's amazing what that can do to you, especially over years of it.
It's torture. It's, yeah, and yeah, I've noticed it in evangelicalism too, like, it just messes up everybody. Because, yeah, I went to a Bible college, and we had Promise Keepers come through too, and they would go to my husband went there as well, and yeah, he's like, yeah, they would come to the boys' dorms, and they would do the talk on masturbation, and you had to have your accountability partners, and it's just, why the fixation with this? It's so weird.
It really is. Can I ask, in terms of, since we talked a lot about how guys would struggle with it, How did they
Hmm.
approach that for the girls in terms of, I assume, keeping you from being a stumbling block, and also maybe just keeping your own thoughts in your own head pure?
Yeah, definitely. We were definitely the ones at fault. We were the temptation. So our dress was extremely modest. High collars, you couldn't just have a low collar dress. Long down to your ankles dress. And then over the years, I think we must have got some people with weird fetishes that came and joined because it got really weird. Um, Stockings had to be certain colors, and you had to wear like nylons or stockings at all times. And I've got an interesting story in this one too that I'm going to come back to. But underwear, first of all, had to be white, could not have lace of any sort, could not be colored, could not be fancy, nothing. And then you had to wear a slip, a full length slip under your dress. And the dresses were extremely full. I think at least 3 or 4 meters or yards of fabric per skirt with pleats. So to disguise any kind of curve there. And in the early days, we didn't have to wear vests or blazers. But then in a few years, that changed, and we had to hide the curve of our waist and our boobs. So the vests couldn't be shaped either. They had to just basically be long hanging things. I remember hearing about how men would get tempted if we were all kneeling down to prayer and a man could see the curve of your butt. So that's where you had to make sure that. So I would always, when I kneel down to pray, I would pull on my vest to make sure that it covered the curve of my waist and butt so that I'm not tempting the young men. They're also tempted by your neck. So you have to wear collars that are high enough. And then towards the end, it got even weirder. And I have my suspicions about who the people with weird fetishes were because they were the ones pushing them. You had to wear socks on top of your nylons because nylon still showed the shape of your feet and you could still see the toes. So you had to wear socks on top, even at home with your brothers and your father.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's
So it
that's
got
pretty
really,
extreme.
really weird. Yeah.
That does sound like
And
somebody had a fetish. Like,
there was definitely a foot fetish there.
hmm.
And they put that on all of us. So, yeah, the dress, definitely that was put on us. We were a constant temptation. So I grew up with this understanding that if I'm ever alone with a man, ever, he's going to be trying to, yeah, that was just, we were never allowed to even sit next to a man, be alone with a man ever in a room. If I'm sitting in a row where there's a man, there needs to be somebody between either my brother or my father or his sister or his mother, some sort of a buffer, so that he and I aren't anywhere close to each other. With
Hmm.
that, it's weird.
It's funny you say these things, but I can actually relate to some of them. A lot of them are pretty far out, but Bob Jones had some measure of things like that. But I remember the one thing was, when the sun goes down, you cannot be near a girl. Like if you're, say you're in the library and you're walking back and said the library is open until 7, but the sun kind of went down at 6 that night, and like it's kind of dark. Um, and of course they don't give you an exact time frame because the sun's is going to be different every day, but they're just like, this is, we're going to trust your judgment. If it's dark, don't be outside with a girl at night. So you can't walk her like back from the library to her dorm, even though if it might feel like it might be safer for her in some ways to have
Mhm.
someone escort her. It's like, no, if it's dark, you can't be near her. If she needs an escort, she can call security. Just don't do it. And it was amazing, the rules that were there. And it's, you definitely got that sense too, like you said, that there's a real danger to men in general. Like, men are just
Mhm.
ravenous wolves. I
Yeah,
But could I
you
ask?
have no self-control.
Yeah, no self control, and they're kind of, it's kind of like, you, if something happens, it's probably explained as it's your fault. You dressed in
Oh,
some
yeah.
way, or you showed something. But did they ever talk about a healthy sexuality, like in marriage? Because I know some groups, ironically, do a good job of that. But
I never was in on any of those meetings. I've only ever heard of from what other married couples have said, but no, I've heard things as restrictive as I do remember being in one sister's meeting where the minister said that I know some men would like their wives to wear fancy nightgowns or negligees or whatever. You do not. You wear your modest nightgown, and modest means long, yeah, high collar, long sleeves, long everything. So basically, you don't take off your nightgown for, yeah,
that's really
that was
crazy.
the insinuation.
So even in
I
the
have since
privacy of their bedroom, they've got to be modest.
That's oh, yeah, that's
Wow.
legislated. I've heard things since that men and women aren't allowed to be in the bathroom together, you're not allowed to be in the shower together. So even married life is legislated to a large extent. A lot of oral and anal were both off the table. Um,
That's crazy. That's so crazy. It's amazing what we humans are capable of doing to ourselves. It's just amazing.
just why do people allow this? So is also my question now. It's like, yeah. But no, no healthy sexuality is taught. And what I'm hearing from the couples there, I think there may be a few who actually enjoy it. But by and large, it seems that women consider sex a chore. It's not, you also aren't allowed to marry people you're attracted to. You marry who God wants you to marry. And that's
Mm,
another really tragic part of this. People who do have any level of attraction to each other or crushes or what they think is love, they're rarely allowed to get together. So you end up with somebody that God wants you with or the ministry wants you with, and it's not somebody you're attracted to.
mm,
And so the amount of extramarital affairs that are happening are just, we hear about them constantly. And I think what we're hearing is just the tip of the iceberg. So
yeah. It's
it's
interesting you say that
people are
because
unhappy.
I heard some guys, I never pursued that mentality, but I remember at Bob Jones, some guys would talk about that, like, I want a girl that is the best fit for ministry. Like, that was their top thing is
Mhm.
if she's a good fit, like, if I want to be a pastor, she's a good pastor's wife, missionary's wife. Like, that was the criteria number one. And yeah, it's heartbreaking. Like, you're completely denying your human sexuality.
But that's part of what this is, though. It's about denying this and squashing it and repressing it. And I think that's what the it's horrible.
Yeah.
And I see pictures of these couples, and there's no affection between them. They try, the photographer tries to stage them, and I'm like, "Ugh." No. It's I don't know, is that just a part of what it is and to trust in the Lord and don't lean on your own understanding and don't trust your feelings and don't and we weren't allowed to develop crushes, and crushes are bad, and so wouldn't that follow that you shouldn't be able to marry somebody that you crush on? So any level of attraction? Because, yeah, I struggled with that one so much.
Mm,
There was one guy that I was definitely in love with, and I developed really strong feelings, and yeah, that was evil and sinful, and I ended up hurting him terribly because of that, because I was trying to quash what I considered to be sinful or to be evil or wrong, and I didn't know what to do. I prayed for God to take these feelings away. I did everything I could, and yeah, it wouldn't work. We were still drawn to each other. It was just, yeah. And so what I ended up I still don't know how I arrived at this, but I remember just agonizing about it, and finally I'm like, "I have to do something. I have to make this stop." So he and his family were away on a trip, and I decided that when they were back, I was going to ignore him until that was done, until all the feelings went away. And I was 17, I think, at the time, so what does a 17-year-old know? But yeah, so he came back and he was trying to get my attention and say hi to me, and I looked past him as if he didn't even exist and just kept on doing that. And I hurt him. I know I did. And we got angry at each other, and that was a horrible stage. I did end up apologizing to him before I left, but just how something as innocent as young love like that is just taken and twisted and broken. And that's a common story. I tell people this, I tell others who leave the story now, and they're like, yeah, that was normal. What else do you do?
mm,
And so just that level of hurt is happening over and over again. And you're not allowed to marry this person, but you're going to marry the person that the ministry chooses for you. And then you marry them and find out you can't stand them. And yeah,
mm,
it's I just always look back and I'm grateful that I got out while I was single because yeah, otherwise that would have been
mm.
it would have been a disaster.
And I'm sure anyone that's, outside of that normal range of, if anyone's struggling with, what they would consider a struggle of homosexuality or anything, and just like you have no shot at actually thriving, none whatsoever.
Oh, and the struggles with homosexuality are miles higher than I've seen anywhere in normal society. Like, what
Mm,
do they say in normal society? It's maybe 10 to 20% that I'm sure those numbers change that have, yeah, but there it's got to be more. In some locations, it's upward of 50% where men are
interesting.
drawn to each other. And yeah, so there's stuff that's happening. And they
Yeah.
have some interesting loopholes to convince themselves that it's not gay sex, that it's something else. But yeah, no, they are the hate that is pushed against homosexuality there is horrific.
Hmm.
And I actually run a recovery page on Facebook just with different resources and stuff. And in June, I ended up doing a whole series about homosexuality, basically, and just, yeah, I posted the link to Pray Away and just different articles and that kind of thing. And people, of course, got angry because all Christians hate anything homosexuality, but the amount of struggle in the church is just horrific. And their fix for it is marry somebody of the opposite sex, and then you will be fixed.
Hmm.
So, yeah, no, there's some very strange sexual dynamics there altogether, but
Yeah.
there's no thriving for anybody. I can't really think of very many couples, maybe a few, but not many that are happy.
That's so sad. I did want to ask before you take us back to the main part of your story, for the theology part of it, were they big into things like end times and Armageddon, or the Christ is coming back any minute, or how did they approach those topics?
We were unique. We have our own take on the revelation. And it's not so much the end times, although they're pushing more into during the pandemic, it went more to the end times thing. But it's more like they've got the beast in Revelation in this, like the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church. So they've got this timeline where they go back across church history, and this is where all these things in Revelation were happening. So it was never much of a focus on what the end is. It's just more their own unique, weird interpretation. And I remember thinking it was so cool when I was in my late teens because I was a smart kid and I was being homeschooled very badly and or church schooled, like it's not even really an education. And so we would have these doctrinal meetings where they would teach about Revelation and what all these symbols meant. And I'm like, oh, this is just so cool. It's just so amazing. And yeah, it was fascinating for me. It felt like some sort of intellectual stimulation, but it varied. So we made fun of everybody who believed in the end times doctrine and the, yeah, rapture or whatever. That's just stupid Christians. They have no idea what they're talking about.
Hmm.
We have the truth.
I do remember seeing a bunch of those charts, like, where they draw where every little piece of human history, like where it fits in the Bible, and they would equate like what happened historically that you could maybe line up with actual history, but what historically shows in the Bible and what it shows as the future, and they just line it up as if the future is already kind of written and
Uh-huh.
literally written, but you can kind of tell like this is prophecy, and just like everything historical is true, everything prophetic is true. And so you kind of have this wonderful guideline map for what to expect if you keep living long enough to see some of this stuff. And it was kind of enrapturing, like it was cool to see it, but at the same time, looking back now, it's like that's really weird. It's really weird.
Well, and they've got that going right now too. They've got like the prophecies. So they say that their ministers can interpret what's happening in everyday life now, and they are prophesying what's going to happen. And I can't make sense of any of it because they jump onto every bandwagon a few months too late. They're basically jumping on conspiracies, and they're like, "This is what it means in the prophecy." And I'm like, "Yeah, everybody stop talking about this already." But yeah, they're just trying so hard to be relevant. And when that the Sound of Silence movie came out in the summer, they jumped on that. They actually sent their people to movie theaters to go watch it. I have my opinions on why they're so fixated with child trafficking, but anyways,
Hmm.
there's a lot of child trafficking that happens within the church. Um, but yeah, so they thought they made this big thing. Our children are not for sale. This is such an amazing movie, and we have the interpretation for it. People need to follow us and listen to us. Of course, nobody did, so that fizzled. But yeah, so they keep on jumping on all this, and this fits into the prophecy, and this fits into the prophecy, and we are interpreting things as they are. In the pandemic, their ministers interpreted correctly as to being a part of the prophecy. They weren't right about any of it.
Hmm.
But they're just so desperate to have this line of prophecy. So yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you for entertaining my extra questions there. Going back to your story, what happened next? So you're at a point where you're kind of neck deep in it, and it's very serious. Like, how did you progress from that point?
Okay, so this was still when I was 10. And so we came back and then we kind of started founding the church here in Steinbach. And my parents pulled in a few people from our old church and a few others. And it never became a very big congregation, but we kind of started, yeah, we became the local congregation. And so we would try so hard to evangelize. We did street meetings. We would go fishing at other churches trying to lure people. Nobody ever went for it. It was very disappointing. um, and just generally being obnoxious. Yeah. And so those next years, they were tough. Those early teen years, I still remember being 14 and just thinking to myself, this is the worst year of my life. It's not possible for things to get any worse than it is. So I think with hormones, with everything else, things at home weren't good, things at church were torture, people at church hated me. I was a I look at my daughter now, she's such a little mini me, outgoing, attitude-filled child, and I loved talking, and I had opinions about everything and just strong-willed, and people hated that, they couldn't stand it, and so they were constantly complaining to my parents about me, and I was constantly getting in trouble, and I was struggling with the confines of everything, and things didn't make sense, and I was trying to learn, and I was trying to expand my brain, and I had so few resources. We were out in the country, away from everybody, wouldn't see people often, so basically my social life was the people from church, and education was not highly prioritized, and for the first few years, I was what I would loosely call homeschooled, which was I was given a Becca and Bob Jones and whatever other crappy curriculum there was, and basically told to figure it out. So I tried, and I would take whatever I could from the books, and they were so bad, especially when it came to biology. And I tried. I think the only reason that I came as far as I did was because of my natural hunger and my drive to find what I could. And I remember, I think it was in 1992, so I would have been 11. A woman from the church died in childbirth because they didn't take her to the hospital until she was dead. They called the ambulance when she stopped breathing. And so I was curious because I'd never heard that childbirth could cause that. And I was asking questions like, why? What happened? What? Nobody would answer my questions. And so I went and found one of our encyclopedias and I looked under childbirth and under anything I could, like, what? Why would this cause death? And then my mom discovered that I was looking at it and she glued the pages shut of the childbirth portion. So I was constantly running up against walls. I was trying to figure out things, trying to learn things, and there was no resources. This was before the days of the internet, and it was hard. I threw myself into it. I became a very dedicated member of the church because that was all I had to do, and so I might as well do it well. But the pressures of it really kept on getting to me. And friendship can when I look back, even at the people I considered my closest friends, you can never really be close to anybody because A, everybody's always looking to throw anybody under the bus, and B, you can't talk about things openly and vulnerable because that's not spiritual. If you have issues, you talk to the ministry or you pray, but you don't talk to friends about it. And so there was no
Mm,
real vulnerability or depth or anything, any sort of heart connection that could really, yeah. Yeah, like, now I look at it and I'm like, "What did we actually talk about?" I think about letters that I wrote my best friend. It's like, "Dear Sister Jane, how are you doing? I am doing so well, thank the Lord. The Lord has been teaching me so many things, and the sermon or the messages we've been hearing have been so wonderful and feeding my soul, and I planted my garden, and I this," but yeah, nothing of depth or substance. There was nobody to turn to talk about the meaningful issues. Anything about
mm,
sexuality or growing up or anything, there was and if you did go either to parents or ministry with that, you were generally shamed for questions you weren't supposed to ask. So you learned I mostly learned to adjust, I think, not entirely. I think I was still too strong of a personality to entirely let myself be crushed. That always got me in trouble because I always said too much or I talked too much about something or I asked the questions I shouldn't ask. And yeah, and I think I was probably 15, 14 or 15 when I started falling for the guy that I loved. And so from then on, it was a struggle because there was so much guilt that was tied up with that. And as far as like my own personal feelings, my own sexuality, I think I learned to turn it off. It's so weird because I know even from early on, my mom would be obsessed with me not having my hands under the blankets when I went to sleep. I'm like, "Why? I'm cold. I don't want the" No, when she came to tuck us in, I had to pull my hands out and over. I'm like, "Why?" And she said
uh,
something vaguely like, "You might touch yourself." And I'm like, what? Okay.
Wow. 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 Mm.
And then at one point, she approached me and she's like, "You've been touching yourself, haven't you?" And I'm like, "What?" She's like, "Because you've got dark lines in the corners of your eyes here." "What do you mean touching?" And so she vaguely explained that, and, I mean, there'd be times it would be itchy and I would scratch, and so then I thought that was what that meant, and so I felt guilty for that, and I would try not to. So I
Wow.
had no idea what sexuality was, no idea how any of that worked, which is incredibly dangerous, especially in those circles where you've got predators that come and join, and these girls have no idea what their sexuality is. Anybody could have done anything, and I wouldn't have known.
Mm.
Um, I
So sad.
remember it's and I've talked to kids since who know even less than I did. So just they purposely fostered that ignorance. I don't know how they and I remember so the conservative Mennonites had a book that was called God's Will for My Body, and that was our sex ed book. And it was all very vague of the furthest you got to what happens in sex is a husband and a wife love each other very much and they come together and a baby is formed. So I knew what happened biologically once the sperm and the egg come together and how the baby is formed inside, but I had no idea how any of that. So it's like come together, like what? Through a kiss? Through something else? Like what? How does this work? And nobody would tell me. And so I remember looking at the book and like, well, maybe if I look at the guys section, that will give me something to work on. And I think my mom was actually ahead of me on that one, and she glued the pages no, she stapled the pages shut. So then I took the pages and I kind of pried them apart between the staples, and I tried to find what I could. And I saw something about wet dreams, which was also not helpful, and I like, "How does this work?" I would ask, and I was told that I would be told before I got married,
Mm.
like, after I'm engaged. And so it was infuriating to me. I had no clue. I knew these feelings I had for boys. I don't even know if they were necessarily sexual. They must have been, but I had no way of categorizing that or knowing. I had just turned off that because I took it so seriously.
Mm. You really get the message that people that go through that really could, I would think, in large part, for most of them, would just struggle with so much in utter silence, like just repressing it all or trying to ignore it. And it's just so heartbreaking. I mean, I've seen portions of it in my experience, but that's really like on
This is
steroids.
yeah, oh, this is and since, like, when I've talked to several young men in their 20s now, and the things they've told me makes me wanna scream. It's just like, I how do you do this to a teenage boy, to a 14, 15-year-old boy? Like, I just the guilt over even a wet dream.
Yeah.
And then they're asked in great detail, "Do you do this? Do you" yeah, and just it's violating and
Seems like that's a
disturbing.
common trope I've seen where they really interrogate, like tell us every little detail of what you did or thought about. And it's
Mhm.
really kind of pretty creepy to think about what they're doing with that information and to why they need it, as opposed to just, Father, I've sinned. Okay, well, let's get you saved. And it's like, well, what exact sin and how long, how many times? It's like,
Why do they I don't know. That feels like sexual abuse to me on so many levels to
yeah.
be doing that, and
Plus,
I don't
having
know.
someone invade your mind so deeply, like you have no privacy, no matter what topic, whether it's sexuality or just, I have a question about who really, how did Moses write the first 5 books of the Bible when part of it says Moses was buried? Like, no, you're questioning too much. That you shouldn't ask that question. Just so much invasion.
And I see the results of it as people leave, like, they are so shattered and so broken, and just to learn to function again just takes so much work, and
Mm.
I thought I had it bad back in my day, but yeah, now as I see these kids leave now, I'm like, uh, most of them will never be okay, sadly.
I know it's jumping
Some
ahead a little bit, but is that still as bad as you're talking about?
yeah, oh yeah. It's
Wow. So this is an ancient history. This is current day
no,
stuff.
this is young men I've been talking to, not even just young men, I've heard ridiculously invasive things from young women as well, that I've talked to in the last few months who've left within the last 5 years.
Mm.
So
Wow.
it's Yeah, it's disturbing, and just to watch them try to process their way through, to talk through it, and to find what is normal. Because they're also told that the world is evil, and the world is all these horrible things, and the things that they say about the world, it's like, yeah, that's not even accurate. A few of the girls have a podcast that they're trying to be relevant about, and they talk about what feminism is. Feminism is women trying to be like men, and they actually have the correct version of feminism because women are different. They accept their differences from men, and they accept that they can be beautiful. I'm like, what are you even talking about? This isn't feminism.
Mm,
But they've got such a twisted version of what everything is out in the world. And so everybody out here is evil and scary, and they are the only ones that are good. And people inside know things aren't good. Like, it's not good in there right now. But they have been told that the world is that much worse. And so you just have to accept what it is, because if you leave, you will, first of all, die within the first year. And also, you will get addicted to drugs, and you will get pregnant or get somebody pregnant, and you will get an STI. They've mapped this out. So a lot of the girls leave and get pregnant quite quickly because they don't use any sort of protection, and people get diseases because they don't use any sort of protection. And they're told they'll get into drugs and alcohol, and so they do. And so these kids are just, so many of them just burn up their lives because that's what they told they will do.
mm.
And they don't know there's another option.
Can I ask, with when you mentioned that you were in touch with a lot of people that leave, I was curious, do most people, in your opinion, leave that church to a different version of Christianity, or do most of them just leave Christianity full stop?
Interesting question. It used to be that you left for a different version of Christianity, especially, well, the youth have always left to go sin, to live a worldly life. There's been
Gotta
some
sow
that
those
have,
wild oats.
but other people who leave because they see through it, a lot of them have historically gone to other churches, usually very conservative, cultish ones as well. And many end up working their way out of it eventually. Some don't. Some end up getting stuck there. It really depends on who you were too when you joined. Some people were always that way, and so they will never move past that. But I've noticed an interesting trend in the last, I don't know, 5 years. They're just walking away from Christianity altogether. And I've heard of people in there who are looking at it. It's like, this is all bullshit. Just,
Mm.
and walking away. And they've always been scared about atheists. When I'm a bit of a formidable enemy there that they don't like talking about. People are curious about me, but they do not, if people ask about me, they're very vague and don't like giving many answers about me. But one of them is that I'm an atheist and I have short hair, and I believe in divorce. Because, yeah, there's been, in the last few years, there's been men who have left and have claimed that the church forced their wives to divorce them when there was reasons their wives wanted to leave them. And so they've pushed against the evils of divorce, and I've pushed back, and I'm like, "No, sometimes divorce can be a really good thing." And so this makes me evil in the eyes of the church, which I think also confuses people, because then they look at me and see that I've been married to my same partner for 17 years. So, yeah, I think the less they try to say as little as they can about me. And but it's the atheism has always been a big one. She's an atheist. She's just this horrible, and I think that's lost the zing that it used to have. It used to keep people from talking to me, and now people are like, "Huh, interesting." So, yeah, I've noticed that trend changing. So I don't know if it's just that people are that much more fed up by everything. It could be that. I'm not sure what has changed the winds of things, but, yeah, I'm noticing more and more people, mostly youth, but people in general, that are leaving and walking away from religion altogether.
I think it's interesting too to think just about how hard it is for people to avoid the internet and technology. And it's just like, where, maybe the only atheist you'd ever heard of 20 years ago or whatever, or 10 years ago was someone like Hitchens, and maybe he seemed extreme. But now it's so easy, if you have any access to Facebook or TikTok or Instagram or whatever, it's so easy to come across people like this, even accidentally, and especially if you're intentionally looking for them. And I'm not sure what kind of internet restrictions they all place, and maybe it's different per family, but in those groups. But it's not hard to find them, and it is. I think it's getting harder and harder to say these atheists are scary. It's like, I'm a dad, for example, myself, that I'm an atheist, obviously very strong atheist, but I've got four beautiful children and I spend all my time thinking about them and trying to love on them. And I spend all my time thinking about how can I help people and love on people. It's like, we're not that scary. And, you get that message enough times, people are going to be like, oh, they're not scary. They're nice
I,
people. In fact, they might even argue nicer than my Christian family.
and I think that's what's happening there. So they used to have really strict internet regulations. Like they used to not allow smartphones. You weren't allowed to have internet at all because the biggest struggle there with the men has always been porn.
Yeah.
You, if you got unsaved for an unspecified reason and you were male, we all assumed it was porn. That was basically, yeah. So that has been their biggest struggle because these boys are chasing down porn because they don't learn anything else. And that's the one thing that they can find. So they've tried to restrict the internet entirely. But I think a big reason of it was also to keep people from learning about normal people's lives. So no Facebook, no social media, you could be punished severely. But in the last 5 years, they've changed that strategy because they're realizing that if they want to reach people, they have to get on social media. So they started allowing a few of them, and now they're allowing more and more of them. And I've heard of people even having, if they weren't allowed to have an official account, they had burner accounts. So people have been reading. They've been reading what detractors say. They've been going on to different social media platforms, learning about things. And I think they're realizing more and more that what they've been taught is bullshit because they're seeing all these other people living normal lives, and they've heard all their lives how backsliders are evil and our lives are horrible and we're falling apart. And you come into social media and you see that I've got a happy family and that I'm living a normal life. And it's like, okay, that doesn't work. So yeah, I think it's doing the age of the internet and letting their people on the internet has done the greatest amount of damage.
Hmm.
And they've been crumbling rapidly in the last 5 years for sure.
Yeah, that's amazing. Going back to your story, what was kind of the final stages of your time in that group, and how did you start to move towards seriously questioning it?
I didn't full on actually start questioning. I was extremely dedicated. Now I'm 17, fully bought into everything. Um, but due to the conflict that had happened with the guy that I loved, with his family, my life was hell at this point. His sister turned on me, it seemed, and I've since found out that she felt the same way about me. So I think what happened is that the leader played a game and turned us on each other. He was an expert at that. He didn't like people being too close, and she was a close friend. And so he would turn people on each other if they were close friends. So there was a conflict there. It felt like they were trying to break me, trying to destroy me. I was being picked on for everything. I was being shunned and pushed away. And I remember just, yeah, feeling like it was utter hell. At that point, I'm 17. I'm thinking seriously about getting married because we usually got married around 18 there. And I was popular and pretty, and I knew that the guys had their eyes on me. So I figured that I would have a marriage offer coming in the near future. But I remember thinking how hellish life was at that point and how I wanted any guy to just come and ask for me, any guy from outside of this congregation, because I wanted to leave here. And so at that point, I would have taken basically anybody who asked and been like, yeah, just get me out of here. Looking back, it's like I could have used my feet, could have walked. I would have had extended family who would have supported me, would have taken me in. It would have been hard to run away before I was 18. They're still doing that now. If kids try to leave before they're 18, they will make their lives hell. So they would have chased after me with the law and whatever. But the instant I turned 18, I could have walked. But for some reason, that was just not something that entered my mind. I needed a guy to come and save me. And now looking back, I can see that the leader had a plan for me, somebody he wanted me to marry. He wanted my life to go a certain way. And so he was playing all the cards to make that happen, but it was making my life pure hell. And my testimonies during that last year were the Lord is refining me in the fiery furnace. Using the analogy of sandpaper, that other saints are like sandpaper wearing me down to refine me to make me pure for Christ.
Iron sharpening iron.
Yes, I'm pretty sure I read that scripture too. It was horrible. Like I was in agony as a 17-year-old, and looking back, it was just such a dark year, and I was in so much pain. And I was also climbing in my spirituality, though, at that point. I could sense that I was becoming more popular. I would, the last year, I would stand up to give a testimony at camp meeting, and I would notice that all the young men would start shouting with approval and turn around and stare at me with approval. I've mentioned that since to others, and they're like, oh, the godly flirting. pretty much. So I was climbing in the ranks. I was one of the leader's pets. He really liked me. He obviously had a plan for me, wanted something, he was going to use me. And so I was fully bought in. This was God's church, no question, nothing about, yeah. And then it might have been late January, early February of 2000. I started noticing rumblings happening. There was a ministers' meeting that was called, and I didn't know much about it. My parents, my dad, yeah, both my parents were ministers, but neither of them were ordained ministers, so they weren't at this meeting. And so they were hearing from another minister that there was some conflict going on. And up to this point, I would have said that never, God's church would never split. It's not possible because this is God's church. It's without spot or wrinkle. Any other church, anywhere could split, that's fine. We are perfect. This wouldn't happen to us. So I never had a fear of split. I remember talking to my cousins once, and what if there's a scenario where there's a split? Haha, that would never happen. That would never happen to God's church. And so the rumblings started happening, and I remember feeling some fear, but it's okay. God will work it out. And what had happened is that 3 ministers had been talking, and they were concerned about the amount of power that the top guy had. And so they called this ministers' meeting to see if they could discuss it. And I guess in the first day of discussions, it didn't go well, and they realized there was not going to be any concessions made. And so they walked out and flew home. And so then what I was hearing is, okay, so they've walked out, but we're working on fixing it. We're going to get one of the other ministers in as mediators. This is going to be fixed. Everybody pray. This is God's church. It's going to be okay. And so I had this bit of fear, but I'm like, no, but it'll work out. It'll be fine. And I think yeah, we had our Wednesday evening service, and there was some tension. You could feel it. But my dad had been given instructions to tell everybody not to talk about it, just pray. God is going to work it out. And then I think it was a Thursday night. I was working at a deli at the local supermarket, and I worked it was a 4 to 10 shift, and so it was dark, and I was going out to my car, which was quite far out from the store, and I noticed that there was a car with lights on, and that was running beside my car, and so I had this cold hand of fear grip me. What is going on? I kept on walking. Why I didn't go back, I'm not sure. Wasn't necessarily the smartest. But I got to my car, and the car that was there was of 2 other young women from the church. And I'm like, what's going on?" And they launched into a speech into how my parents were leaving the church and how my dad has always said that even if he left, he wanted his family to stay. I'm like, "What are you talking about? They're not leaving the church." And they're like, "Yeah, they are. And you need to stay." So I'm 18 at this point, and they could have pulled me back in. And so this was the first time I remember that cold hand of fear actually really grabbing me, like, this is not going to be okay. And I went home that evening, and I'm like, "What is going on?" By Sunday morning, everything had fallen apart, and we came for a church service, and it was the most traumatizing experience. The room basically turned into people yelling and screaming at my parents and accusing them of all kinds of stuff. I don't even remember what. I just know I was sitting there sobbing as my world was falling apart. I know these are lies. I know these things didn't happen, and I just didn't know what to do. And the hostility just all around me, and I just yeah, I was sat there helplessly crying. There was nobody. I felt alone, nobody there to support me. And again, when I look at an 18-year-old kid and that the amount of trauma that this was, yeah, it's pretty surreal. And after the service was over, this continued, and people continued yelling at my parents. And I remember the one scene where the guy that I had loved was yelling at my dad about something, and it was loud and hostile. And I remember thinking, this is because he's mad at me. There's all kinds of enmeshment going on there. So I took responsibility for myself, apparently. And so I somehow had the courage to speak up and say, "Brother so and so, does this have to do with what happened between you and me?" And his voice dropped, and he's like, "No, this has nothing to do with what happened with us." But yeah. And so Yeah, there was just a few of those moments that I remember, but it was full on hostility, and I'm like, "I don't know how we're gonna be okay. I don't know how this is gonna work out." By Sunday evening, I don't even know if we had a service. Most people didn't come if we did. I think Sunday morning was kind of the peak. By Monday morning, they were coming in because the school building that the church school building was in our yard, they were coming and getting, their books and stuff because we were no longer gonna be having school together. And so the next week was absolute hell. I didn't know what was happening, and the church sent up a big damage control group from all over the US and Canada, and they had a service. And at this point, I'm like, I haven't left the church. Like, I don't know what's going on here. I don't know why people are lying because, again, the sin free life, you're not supposed to be lying and showing hatred. So, where is this coming from? And so I didn't know what was happening. I was in a state of limbo. And, but at this point, after having been accosted out by my car in the parking lot, I knew that they were going to do this again now that they had this whole rescue group out. And so I went into my shift that Saturday morning. And I purposely parked in a different area of the building altogether so that they wouldn't know where my car was, and went in for my shift. And as the last 15 minutes of my shift, I looked up and there was some of my friends from all over the US who were standing there waiting for me. And I saw them and my heart dropped. I'm like, I can't escape this because there was only one exit out of there. And so I walked out and they wanted to talk to me. And I knew nothing about boundaries or saying no at that point. So, and these were my friends. I didn't want to walk away from them. So I agreed to go and talk to them. And so they took me off into another area of the mall and they started working on me. And the one thing I was holding on to was, but I haven't sinned. And these people did. They were lying. They were showing hatred. Why are they in good favor? And why am I on the outs? This doesn't make sense. This was still the core doctrine for me, and that didn't make sense to me. And then one of the ministers came and he started working on me. And I remember the one thing he said is like, I've been out in the world. I know what it's like out there. And I can tell you there is nothing but misery and heartache and horribleness, basically. There is no love. You will never find love like you have known in the Church of God again. And at this point, I'm just sitting there numb. I'm like, I mean, this is love. What I'm seeing is love. But I didn't know what to do. And so I went to their service that evening. And I'm like, I'm still in good terms with God. God and I are good. I'm still in the real Church of God. I haven't gone wrong. So I raised my hand. I participated in the singing service. And actually, when I had walked in, one of my friends who was sitting in the front saw me and she motioned for me to come and sit with her. And I considered it. And then I saw the girl that had turned on me sitting there. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going up there. So I sat in the back and I participated in the service. And the sermon was about the children of Korah and how they fought against Moses and then God swallowed them up. And yeah, that was what was going to happen to
Of
us.
course.
So it was a horrible service. And so I was there with another family that had also been splitting off. And they had a daughter my age. And so she and I were sitting together. And so we walked out together. And suddenly I was surrounded by a crowd of, I don't know, I'm guessing 40 women, basically pinning me up against the wall, surrounding me in a semicircle. And they started working on me. And now, again, if I look at it from outside eyes, at an 18-year-old being surrounded by 40 people, just so the other girl that I was with, she was shy. She didn't do any of the talking. This talk was aimed at getting me back. I was a shining star that they wanted to keep. And so several women started working on me. One of the women that I had pointed out had lied, came and she's like, they told me that you said this, and you're right, I did lie. I'm sorry. I'm like, okay, but you're still in the good books. I'm not. How does this make sense? And they kept working on me. And that's what they do. Like they grind on you and they wear at you, and you don't have boundaries to say no and walk away. And so another woman started working on me, and just it was the family that I had been in conflict with. And she was giving me all these reasons I should come back. And one of them was like, if you come back, everything will be good with our family again and we will love you. And for some reason, that was what broke me because I wanted that so badly. And I was so tired of the conflict and I was so tired of everything hurting. And it just wouldn't yeah, I was so broken at that point, and I just wanted something to be normal and something to be right. And so I opened my mouth to say that, "Yes, okay, I'll do it." But she kept talking. She didn't take a breath. She kept going and going and going. And I remember stepping back and thinking, I'm like, "Actually, I can get back to them tomorrow if I decide I wanna come back. I don't have to say it today. I'm gonna sit on this." And then I started thinking of how I can get out because I didn't have my own vehicle. I was there with the other family and with my mom. And if I say that I need to go, my ride is probably waiting. I knew very well that they would say, "No, no, that's fine. We'll take you home." And then I would be really and truly stuck. So I'm like, "How do I get out of this? I need to get out of this." And I think my body shut down and went into survival mode at that point because I just remember, like, the adrenaline, just feeling frozen and feeling it was horrible. And finally, the other woman we had driven with, she came to the edges of the crowd and she looked at me and she's like, "You ready to go?" I'm like, "Yeah." And then the crowd parted to let me out. And I think deep down, I knew that was it. Much as I had left open that I can call them back and tell them I'm coming back, I knew this was it. And so yeah, I was surrounded by 40 women, and there was a line of young men across against the wall watching me. And there was a steep set of stairs that I needed to go down to get outside. And I wanted to hold on to the banisters because my legs were shaky because the adrenaline and just the trauma, everything was horrible. And there was young men lining the banisters staring at me. I'm like, oh. So I somehow managed to steady my legs enough to walk down those stairs. And I remember just opening the door and feeling the cold February air hit me in the face. I'm like, it's over. I don't know if I'm ever going to be okay again. I don't know if life will ever make sense. I just walked away from everything I've known, but it's over. It's done. And yeah, I remember going to the car and thinking that, yeah, I said I'll go back, but yeah, that was it. That was the last time I would see these people again. And I was probably numb and in shock to a large extent. And the next few months were horrific. Just the personal pain of everything, of my world falling apart. Here, I thought I was going to be getting married within the next few months to somebody. And now I'm alone. I have nobody. There was the group that had split off, but there was no marriageable guys my age. And yeah, I had no idea what my future would look like. Everything I had planned was done.
Well,
And they also harass you when you leave. And thankfully, because this was a fairly big split, I wasn't the only one they were focused on, but they would come by my office where I would work. I had just switched jobs to work at a travel agency, and I would sometimes be working by myself in the evenings. And even during the daytime, though, they would walk by my office staring at me. One of the women came in and she yelled at me and just lit into me and told me how evil I was. And I remember having a panic attack after that. I went to the back and I was crying and I couldn't stop. Just the levels of trauma were just unbelievable at that point. And I would get into my car at night, and we weren't allowed to listen to much music there either. We were only allowed to listen to church music, basically, and I did not want to listen to church music because that was triggering. And so I went back to tapes of the church of my childhood and started playing those. And there was one song in particular that I would rewind and play over and over and over again. And it was just so comforting. It's one of those things that is so viscerally burned into me that if I play it now, I still cry because, yeah, it was just such a powerful, comforting thing. And I remember this presence would come and surround me as I was falling apart and sobbing in my car. And I think abandonment is just something I felt like I technically had my family, but I don't think I felt like I had any support. And so, yeah, I would just sit in the car and cry, and I would feel this comforting presence come and surround me and just, yeah, envelop me in a hug and tell me that you'll be okay. And so later on, as I started questioning religion and everything altogether, I'm like, but there was something there, something that surrounded me. There was that presence. There must have been a God of some sort that did it. And that I think kept me believing in Christianity as long as it did. Just that visceral sense that I felt then. But yeah, then over the next few months, people started surrounding me. And I was thankfully very open. I would talk to people. That was my way of dealing with the trauma. I talked. And the people who had to listen to me over and over again, I'm sorry. But yeah, it was just, there was so much processing I needed to do. And so people from work understood what I was going through, and people from the church of my childhood took me under their wings. And slowly my support circle started expanding, but they all took me in and they loved me and they supported me and they let me talk and they let me heal. And also the one thing that I hadn't been allowed to do in the church was to take voice lessons. I was a good singer. I had natural talent, but I could tell in those loud services where we sung at the top of our lungs that I was burning out my vocal cords. It was bad, and my throat would hurt at the end of it. And so I went to the leader and I had asked him, "Can I please go and take voice lessons to learn to use my voice better?" And he's like, "Nope." I'm like, "But like destroying my voice. I can feel it." And he's like, "The Lord will be your voice teacher." So
Well,
that annoyed me a lot. And that was one of the first things I did after leaving as well, was to find a voice teacher, which pulled me into the music community of the area, and I got to know other younger people my age. I got involved with festivals and recitals and just got to know people, and people in the music community are lovely in general. So, I think it was that was probably my single biggest lifesaver, to get connected to that community. And,
just clarify. So the churches and so forth, they're all you're surrounding yourself at first by other Christians that are less legalistic, but
yes,
then the outside source was the music community,
it
or
was a
was that
very
Christian too?
it was mostly Christian. Steinbach is a very religious town.
Okay,
Heavily Mennonite, very Bible Belt. So basically everybody I knew in those early days were Christians.
so everyone that's helping you technically heal is
Yeah.
still in some ways giving you the message of you just needed a different version of Christianity. You still need Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I see it as a good thing. It was more of a soft cushion for me to work my way out. I think walking away from everything would have been way too traumatizing for me at that point, because I was still very serious about my faith. My I took God seriously, like that was all. And I started looking at young men and I'm like, okay, so I want a godly young man because that's always what I've wanted, right? And so I'm meeting these worldly Christian young men, but they're not super spiritual. They don't talk about God 24/7. I'm like, okay, but I do want somebody godly. And so we were starting to attend really conservative churches, like conservative Mennonites, that kind of thing. Still very legalistic. And I would get to know these young men and I'm like, "Okay, so they're technically godly, but I don't want them." Like, there's something about, so now I've got this juxtaposition. I'm learning to get to know worldly young men, and they are what's feeling comfortable to me. The godly young men that I'm getting to know really aren't, and they're weird, and they stare, and they're creepy. So that was a tough transition point. And I had some really weird, creepy guys come after me. I have some stories. I had one who actually came and proposed to me at my office. And I was still in this awkward stage because I have long hair up in a bun or down somehow, but really long hair, dressing somewhat conservatively. So I'm just attracting the weirdos at this point. That's all. And it was so frustrating because I'm getting to know these really nice young men, but they weren't just interested in me because I'm still conservative and weird. And I think my husband actually saw me because he was also in the musical world. He was a singer as well. And so he saw me at one of the festivals and he's like, "Yeah, just thought you were a weird conservative girl." And so then we got involved. I don't know if you've ever heard of Charity Christian Fellowship.
Yeah.
They're kind of an offshoot of the conservative Mennonites and Amish. Kind of what this Church of God Restoration is to the larger body of the Church of God, calling out, being more pure, being more on fire, being more alive. The leaders were extremist, and so we got caught up with them, and they sounded really cool. And we started going to some of their services. And there was one young man who was interested in me, and again, he stared and was creepy. But at this point, I'm starting to look at my options. I'm 18, 19. I'm getting old here. I need to get married. And so I wasn't sure what I was going to do, and they wore head coverings, and the pressure started building on me. I need to wear a head covering, and I'm like, "Ugh." Church of God did not teach that we had to wear head coverings because our hair is our covering. So I'm really feeling torn, and I'm noticing that the young women are starting to ostracize me because I haven't put the covering on yet. And so it came to a head when they held a tent meeting up here in Manitoba because they were doing a big scoop of the Hutterite colonies. They were scooping the Hutterites out. And so we attended some of those services. And I remember just feeling how the young women were really pushing me away, didn't want anything to do with me. So now I'm really caught between two worlds. I am leaning more into the worldly side of things because I know this music community and they're lovely people. But shouldn't I be godly and Christian and conservative still? And so, yeah, things came to a head and things were really wearing at me. And I'm just like, I can't do this much longer. And I think the final trigger point for me was going to their baptism service. And the leader who was doing the baptism is like, do you renounce Babylon and come to the true church or something? The language. And I'm like, okay, that's it. That's it. Cannot do this again because that's the language we used to use. And I'm like, I am not going down this path again. I think we had started attending because it felt comfortable and familiar. But for me, the comfortable and familiar wasn't good enough. It was just, I'm done. I cannot do this anymore. And so we're out in the middle of the country. I'm here there with my parents. Don't have a way to get home. It was probably a 2-hour drive to get home. And I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm like, I can't stay. I cannot go to another service. I cannot do this. And my parents wanted to stay. And I basically had a panic attack. I'm like, I can't. I didn't know what else I could do. And it's funny because in telling the story to my husband's uncle and aunt, they're like, we actually live just down the road. You could have just walked over to our place. And I'm like, yeah, if I would have known that I could trust random strangers, which now I would absolutely, I would walk down to some farmhouse and ask for help. But then I didn't know that was an option and I still felt trapped. And yeah, so I think I had enough of a panic attack that my parents were like, okay, fine. So as the song service is starting, um, yeah, and even that was triggering me. I was just at maximum trigger point at that point. We drove away and went home. And I'm like, okay, that's it. I'm done. So the next day, I went to a clothing store in Steinbach and I bought 2 dresses that had short sleeves and slits. And that was just the most worldly thing for me. I'm like, this is like such a turning point. And I remember how evil that felt, like just, yeah, deliciously breaking the standard. Looking back, they're very plain. They were nice, but
Yeah.
it was my breaking point. And so
But
I
it
think
sounds very
I'm
brave, right? At that point, for someone in your background, that's a brave step.
huge. Yeah. And I was 19. So still a young kid, really. And so then I decided I'm done with this conservative church business. I am going church shopping. So I remember finding a newspaper and looking at all the different churches in Steinbach, looking at their church times. And so I was going to go and figure out where I wanted to go. Right now, I'm still so skittish of anybody in ministry or authority, and I'm very well aware of the love bombing methods that we used. So I actually developed a strategy where I would show up for a church service a few minutes late after things had started, would sit through it, and then I would leave a few minutes early before like during the closing prayer or something, so nobody could talk to me. And so we did this for a few weeks. Nothing really resonated. And then I remember coming into one church and they had a choir, and the sermon was calm and orderly and structured, and there was no hysteria, no nothing. And I just remember feeling like I was home, like that this was it. And so I did the dash in and dash out for a few more weeks. I still didn't want to talk to anybody, didn't want anybody to influence me. And then finally, on one of my dashes out, a woman that I knew from the community, she had known me since I was a young kid. She ran out after me. And she's like, Gloria, wait. And she ended up plugging me in with some of the youth in the church and getting me introduced to a few other people. So I started getting involved, and there was a choir there that and I missed singing so much. Singing had always been my thing. And so I called the church office and asked how I could join the choir, and they got me connected. And those were really the years of my biggest healing. Like that, yeah, the next 2 years, I think the people in the choir took me in and they loved me and they were just, yeah, they're so wonderful. I was still so shy and nervous. I've talked to somebody who's like, yeah, I remember that shy, timid little young woman and how you blossomed and bloomed over the next little while.
Hmm.
So I was surrounded by so much love and compassion there. And then I remember Providence College was in a town not far away from here, and they had a big partnership with this church. So they ended up doing a spring concert. I think it was the spring of 2002. And I went to that because I wanted to hear a choral concert. And just everything about that evening, I sat there crying because I see this group of young people in a choir, and this is something I've wanted so badly, and I feel like I've been cheated of having, and I'm never going to. And then I suddenly get this little thought, what if you could join this? What if you could do this? But I'm working full time and I don't see any way I can make this work. But I pick up some of the literature that they had, and I contacted the college a few days later asking for a tour. And they, yeah, met somebody who took me for a tour of the campus. I'm like, huh, I think I can make this work. It was just, it started unfolding in my mind and the choir was going to be going to Europe that next year on their tour, and I'm like, "I want that." Like, that was probably my single biggest motivator, the Europe tour. And so I signed up for the next only planning to make this a one-year thing. Signed up, I did the audition, and I had no idea of my talent or whatever. I knew I was a decent enough singer in the cult, but what does that mean anywhere else? And so I was nervous when I came for the audition, and the choral conductor was so lovely and kind and compassionate, and he did my audition. And when the audition paper or when the acceptance papers came out, my name was there. So yeah, those are definitely the best few years of my life there. Um, I did a one-year program that was just mostly music focused. And yeah, that was really all I wanted. I wanted the tour, wanted a bit of music education, that was it. Towards the end of the year, my voice teacher came up to me and she's like, "I really think you should consider doing this longer. Like, I really think this would be good for you." And I hadn't at that point, but something in me stirred. I'm like, I yeah, it had been just being together with the young people my age, learning these things. And Providence is a liberal arts college, so it wasn't an indoctrination Bible college. It was making you think. And even in that first year, I remember the professor is kind of throwing me for a loop because it's like, well, some scholars think this happened, some things this did, and yeah, it wasn't the complete literal biblical interpretation I was used to, and that really threw me. I'm like, how can that be? And yeah, so I signed up for a 3-year degree, and I think it was in my second year that I hit my faith crisis because I started asking questions and picking things apart. And I'm like, okay, so what I was taught was all bullshit. We can face that, but let's throw that all away, pick this apart, actually figure out what I do believe in. So I went on a quest to find the truth, to really strengthen my faith and figure out exactly what I believed in and what God was to me. And partway through, I realized that I was in trouble and everything started falling apart. And for me, again, I kept coming, okay, so this doesn't make sense, and this concept doesn't make sense, and this doesn't fit. But there was still that presence that surrounded me when I was falling apart during that worst time of my life. So that had to be God, right? Like nothing makes sense anymore, but there has to be a God. So I think it was my second or maybe in my third year that I finally came to the conclusion that, okay, things don't make sense. I'm tired. This hurts. I don't want to do this anymore. I choose to believe in God. The questions that I still have, they can wait. We'll come back to that later. But right now, I choose to believe God is still real to me because he still felt so real. And also the thought of walking away, because at this point, my whole community is Christians and absolutely lovely people. And I couldn't handle the thought of that. And the guy that I liked was also, we weren't dating yet. We were best friends. But I knew that if I were to come out and walk away from the faith, that would probably put a serious strain on our friendship. So yeah, all these reasons played into it. I stayed and ended up graduating. And yeah, those were, I remember Great Is Thy Faithfulness was the school song, and we sang that at all the different events. And for me, that was just such a powerful song, especially all I have needed, thy hand has provided. And just given all the trauma and everything and how I had been brought into such a wonderful place, that would always get me to cry. And I remember during graduation, I wanted to sing it because it was the last chance to sing it as my time in school, and I cried through most of it. So yeah, they were incredibly impactful years. And I think at the back of my mind, I knew I wasn't done with all this yet, wasn't ready to go there. And My husband and I started dating later that year and got married a year later. And I remember early, so we still were going to church. We tried to do the whole, I'd always heard that when in a marriage, you need to pray together. That's what holds together a marriage, right? The cord of three strands thing. We tried it. It was awkward and weird and didn't work. And okay. So I think we were both, at this point, we were part of kind of not really a debate club, but well, you've talked to Daniel Dacombe, right? We were part of a group in college and we would debate everything. Nothing was off limits and we hit some hard subjects. And so we were all kind of pushing the envelope. And actually, most of the people in that group have since left religion. So,
Hmm.
yeah. um, so we were both, we'd been questioning and working through ideas together, but we were still Christians. This was still important. It was a childhood thing for both of us. And then, yeah, we attended church. That didn't quite feel right anymore. It was an evangelical church. And we were both leaning more towards Anglican, which is Episcopalian in the States, I guess. And we had incorporated parts of that into our wedding ceremony. I had been attending a church in the city sometimes. We really liked the style of the worship. And so our whole theology, everything was moving left. And we were attending church less and less frequently. And he was having his own questions. I'm not sure exactly what triggered his, but yeah, he was starting to ask questions, but he's still, for him, he would read, he's been very scholarly about his. So he would read these books and no, it still makes sense. Christianity still makes sense for XYZ reasons. And then I remember watching Religulous by Bill Mayer's movie and all these different claims about how Christianity is unique and how it really isn't. And for me, it's like, yeah, it didn't really bother me because again, I was looking back, I was a Christian agnostic. I didn't really believe it anymore, but I chose to believe. But he still took it seriously. So I remember him walking in on me watching this movie, and he watched for a bit, and he was so distressed, he got up and walked out. He couldn't handle it. And I think that really precipitated his. And seeing him start to question and pick apart his faith, I'm like, oh crap, here goes mine, because my questions came back. And so we both kind of hit the spot of, okay, well, that's over at the same time. It went really quickly at that point. And we were both kind of horrified of like, well, you've always heard of these stories of what happens to people who walk away from religion, who leave their faith, and your life is going to fall apart and your marriage is going to fall apart and everything is going to be terrible. And nothing changed. If anything, we both felt more peace.
Hmm.
And yeah, so it was interesting how that all worked. But yeah, for me, it was just a long, slow graduation from extreme right religion to out.
Hmm. That story is just, it's amazing. And number one, I'm applauding the fact that you all deconverted together, which is obviously the ideal, or close to it together, ending up with the commonality that, you can kind of keep going with this journey and this discovery and this adventure together. But wow, just you went through from such an extreme. Like, I feel like in some ways my story was like I went from a pretty extreme group, Bob Jones and so forth. But when I hear your story, it's like, your story was just so much further. And I can see how, like you mentioned the word trauma, like every stage to get to the next level of liberalism or whatever you call it, or rationality, like each stage would be a trauma. It'd be really hard to do it and not feel like I have just violated what I stood for. Like I've really broken faith with the person that I've been standing up for. I've been, faithful to the Lord and faithful to this kind of Christianity. And now I'm kind of, crossing that Rubicon and I can't go back now. And to do it over and over and over in all those stages. And at that point, eventually, I guess too, once you've gone through enough stages, you kind of, this thing is in flux because I've already moved 3 stages. Is it another 3 or is it another 10 or, which stage is the end one? But to realize this thing is very much in flux and to be realizing that life is not black and white, it is very gray. That's so scary when you're coming from such a conservative background.
Terrifying. I look back at younger me and I'm like, I don't know how I had the courage to face some of those things. And even when it came to things like gay rights or LGBTQ issues, I faced that one really early on in my college years, actually, which was surprising. But one of the guys I had been friends with in the choir in my first year, he ended up coming out as gay, and the entire community turned on him, basically. He got so many hate letters from the
Mm.
college community, Christian world around him in general. And I remember watching this happening, and I didn't know anything about gays except that they were gross and disgusting and shouldn't be able to live, basically. But we never really talked about it in detail. It was just judgment and ew. And so I had never explored that myself. But when I saw this happen, this young man that had been a really good friend, and seeing people turn on him and hate him, I'm like, I can't do that. I have to actually figure out what's happening here. So I remember going on a quest and asking questions and trying to figure out, so is this curable? Is this fixable? And we actually had an ex-gay from Exodus Ministries, I think it was. They're defunct now, but yeah, he came and he gave a speech because as a result of this, it had thrown the whole college community into such an upheaval. And his speech was not satisfactory. I don't remember what he said. It did not answer my questions. So I went up to him later on and I'm like, okay, so I have a few questions here. So can this actually be fixed? Like, so he's ex-gay, right? Like, so are you now attracted to women? And he's like, I deeply love my wife. I'm like, okay. Are you still attracted to men? He's like, oh, if I see a handsome young man, yeah, absolutely. I can still see he's good. I'm like, okay. So, like, are you sexually fulfilled by your wife? And he's like, well, put it this way. If I put a paper bag over your head and stimulate you, you're going to be stimulated and it doesn't matter who it is that's doing it. I'm like, there we go. That's my answer. And so I think that was the breaking point for me. I'm like, it's not curable. It's not fixable. I have to learn to accept this. So even I was still a very devoted Christian at that point. And that was in what, early 2000s? So it still wasn't cool to be Christian and accepting. And I became a very fierce ally at that point. So I don't know why I became so strong on that point. Maybe it's because I had also felt ostracization. I don't know. Because it's, yeah, interesting to look back. That's so freshly out of the cult that I was able to change my viewpoint on that. But maybe it's because I was already so used to changing my viewpoint on so many different things and learning the gray.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting. It's an interesting topic, and I had something similar happen where I had moved to Georgia from Philadelphia, and for medical history, a very special doctor here that I was coming for, and that was a great experience. Great, I'm glad I came. But I didn't have a car at first. I'd used the bus all over where I would need to go to in Philadelphia, but here where I was, this part of Georgia that I was in, north of Atlanta, it did not have bus routes like that by any stretch. Like it was almost non-existent. And so the idea of you need a car now, it was like, okay, I can't put this off anymore. And so I went in and the guy that was selling me the car, I was like, I found out he's a very dedicated Christian. And as we're talking and spending hours, going through paperwork and so forth, I end up, tell me your story. And he ends up talking about this exact thing where he's struggling with this, of he's gay, but isn't acting on it. And then 2 months later, I'd come back in for, hey, there's something issue with the car. Can we fix this? And, hey, I ended up coming into the shop enough times in that first year. And he was like, it would work out where there was no one to sell to at the moment. So he's just sitting there waiting for someone to come in and wants to buy a car. So we chat for an hour here, an hour there. And over that year, I chatted with him 5 or 6 times. And I was like, this is an honest to God, really nice guy who wants so much to be in a relationship, but he feels like he can't do it. But he's like, he can't switch. Like you say, he can't switch and just, want a woman. It's not in the cards for him. And it really broke my heart for his story. And it was one of the first times that I thought to myself, this isn't, like you said, this isn't some weird, icky guy. This is one of the nicest guys I've ever met in my life. And I have to reframe this. I have to reframe how I see him. And it's amazing how that changes when you actually have acquaintances and friends that are in that bucket. And it's just like, what you were told is not true. These people are not horrible people. They're wonderful people.
Yeah. And I think if you're at all honest with yourself, then you have to face it. And yeah, so I think, yeah, for me, it just wasn't ever in question. I couldn't turn on him the way others were.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an interesting point of my development. And looking back, it's a weird point for me to have come to that. But yeah, I think that all fit in with all the questions of everything. And that also played into everything falling apart, because why does the church treat gays so badly as well? That was a part of it.
So at that point, when did you first start to become public about this worldview shift?
That's That took a little bit. I think we were both in shock when it happened and didn't want to talk about it at first. So I think we were probably quiet maybe for 6 months or so, and then we started talking about it and being open about it, and ended up losing quite a few friends over it. A lot of Christians who were not okay with it. I was surprised at some of the ones who did stick around our lives. A lot of our friends are still Christians, um, and it's just generally liberal Christians, though. But yeah, it was tough, and we faced a lot of pushback. People really didn't like that questioning. And it's still especially when I run into more conservative people, they still think that they can convert me back, that I'm just hurt because I had the bad experience in the cult, and I'm like, "Oh, no, 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 it's not nearly that simple." Yeah, it's I don't know, something I talk about less in general now. I think it's more established for me, and it is just what it is, and you don't like it, that's too bad.
How did your parents respond?
It wasn't really a big deal with my parents. I think they were kind of on the edges themselves. So, yeah, mine were fine with it. His we didn't talk about it for a while. His mom had actually passed away shortly after we got married, but his dad and his stepmom, I think they had known, and we figured out roughly when they found out, because up to that point, they would use God language, like it was a God thing or thank God or something, and then we noticed that stopped, and I'm like, "Oh, they found out somehow." But he still hadn't figured out how to tell his dad. And then I remember making a comment to the stepmom about being an atheist, and she jumped on that. She's like, "Okay, I would really love to hear your story. I'd love to hear how you came to this place. Now that you've said it, I didn't wanna ask, but now that you've said it, I want." Yeah. So we ended up meeting
Hmm.
with them and telling them, and they were really good about it and just wanted us to know that they would be respectful and wanted to know how we felt about how they interacted with our kids and whatever. So it was never really any issue as far as that goes. His brother had a bit of a harder time with it. His sister is a very liberal Christian, so we're mostly on the same page with most things anyhow. I think the hardest was maybe my grandma, because for her, she was deeply religious, and I didn't want to tell her. She was in her 80s, and I didn't wanna do that to her. But she's a smart bird, so I don't know how she figured out if she heard from somebody else or what, but she cornered me and asked questions until I had to say, and I'm like, "Yeah, fine." So she worked on getting us back, and she would try to send us tracts or tell us that God is real, and every phone call, I'm like, "Grandma, you have to stop. Like, we're never going to agree on this." And even at my grandpa's funeral, I remember she came and talked to me, and she's like, "You've built this beautiful family and all this, and that's all very nice and good, but you're never gonna be really happy until you find Jesus again." And I'm like, "Oh." I left it at that. But yeah, she passed away last year, and she would still bring it up in phone conversations, just kind of the token. Prayer works, God is good, whatever. But I think she learned to stop pushing after a while because it just wasn't going anywhere. So that was
Hmm.
probably the hardest as far as family goes. Yeah.
Could I ask what age were your kids? If you said this before, I apologize if I missed it. But what age were your kids when you deconverted?
No, they weren't born yet.
They weren't born. Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious then. Maybe a different question. How do you feel like the deconversion affected the way that were able to see how your role in parenting? Like, how do you parent differently than you would have, not just in terms of the strict, is Jesus real and do you need the gospel, but just all over? Like, how has this affected your ability to start parenting with them once they came to the picture?
I think it's a lot less pressure in general. If there's no eternity that you need to shape your kids for, you can just enjoy and let them be and raise them to be as good as human beings as possible. So, yeah, that's kind of we've taken a very loose interpretation maybe of it. We talk about religion because we obviously have religious families, and they've been to funerals and different church services and stuff, so we'll talk about it. And it's mostly, yeah, some people believe in Jesus, they believe this. I've talked about my wacky background, which my daughter is especially horrified by, and she's heard me talk some of the details with others. She's like, "Oh, that sounds horrible." I'm really quite spoiled, aren't I? And I'm like, "Yeah."
It's amazing. I'm sure they can't quite grasp just the actual complexities of it. It's such a different world now.
No, just any of it, like the corporal punishment or just the extreme restrictions on everything, they're just kind of like,
Yeah.
which I love. I love that it horrifies and shocks them because they'll never know a life anything close to this.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, But yeah, so like in school, my son had one kid that was evangelizing to him and telling him that God was real. So whenever the kids have asked us if God is real, we kind of ask them, "What do you think?" Like, we don't believe he is, but how do you feel about it? And so, yeah, for a while, he went through a stage of he doesn't know why, but he thinks God is real. And we were like, okay, could see the typical evangelism working here, but all right. And forget what. I think we were talking about some of the abuses that are done in the name of religion or something. And he's like, oh, never mind. So, yeah, we hold it very loosely. And I still, with choral singing and with being connected to the music community the way we are, a lot of it is sacred singing still.
Yeah.
So did a big concert in July, which was a celebration of Mennonites coming over from Ukraine to Canada. And so it was completely a sacred concert. And my daughter was singing in it as well. And so, yeah, we're singing all these religious songs. And I'm like, it's part of my heritage. It's a part of my life, my journey that I have pleasant memories of. I don't mind singing religious songs. Yeah, but
Mm.
that's all it is.
I kind of feel that way about Christmas in general. I know people struggle with it. Some people do, but I'm just like, it is what it is. I know Christmas, started before Christ, but the Christmas that we've come to know kind of evolved strictly with Christ and evolved from there. And it's about Jesus Christ. For at this point, for the church. It's about Jesus. It's a Christian
Mhm.
holiday. Even if it didn't start that way, it is now. It is what it is. I can still love Christmas and enjoy the tree and the presents, and I don't enjoy like the songs where they're actually singing, Jesus Christ is Lord or whatever. But if it's just like the tune in the background, I kind of like, it is what it is. It's like you said, it's part of my heritage. It's where I come from.
Mhm.
But I was really curious, and I know we've gone long here, so I'll wrap this up shortly. But could you speak for a minute about the healing journey after deconversion? I know it sounds like you kind of went through several stages of early healing as you were going through this whole thing, but once you were like actually out, fully out, like this isn't real, did you feel like you had tons of healing left to do, or did you feel like you'd done
Well,
most of the healing by that point?
I think because I had already reached Christian agnosticism at that point, I don't think there was much left for me. It was just kind of like dropping the last bit. I remember as that crisis point was hitting, I'm like, okay, God, this is your chance. Like, I've known this last set of questions would come up, and I've known where it would most likely lead. So I still want to believe in you. I want to believe this is true. So this is your chance to prove yourself to me. Like anything, just somehow prove yourself to me if there's anything. And I just remember feeling complete silence and nothing. I'm like, okay, that's it.
Hmm.
It wasn't even a massive sense of loss. I think my husband struggled more with that, especially the loss of the afterlife and that kind of thing. I don't know. For me, it just felt like it was the last bit of a garment that didn't really fit me properly that just fell off. And that was that. I think most of my trauma and for me, the religion after the cult was such a positive healing experience, and so tied up with my general healing that I still hold a lot of fondness for it. So, yeah, it's not like I'm angry at religion as such. It just didn't make sense for me anymore. It just didn't fit.
Hmm.
I'm angry at what the cult did, yes, but yeah,
Yeah.
that was
Well, I love the fact that you're trying to help people that are willing to come talk to you about it. Could I ask a final question, maybe to wrap us up? For anyone that's in the thickest, hardest part of it, the part where there are 40 people surrounding you, even if it's not literally that, it's just 40 people in your head of saying, what is wrong with you? Why won't you just get in line with the Christian worldview? Why won't you stop? Why won't you admit that these questions are from the devil, or that we've got good answers? You just want to sin, and there's something in their heart that's just saying, I can't go forward, but I can't go back. I'm right here, and this is crazy land. Like, I don't know what to do. My heart is breaking either way. Whether I go back, I'm heartbroken. If I proceed with my deconversion, I'm heartbroken. Or maybe they may not even use the word deconversion or the thought of it. They're not necessarily thinking God's not real. They're just saying, I can't go back. Something about that is intrinsically wrong, and I don't know what's left. Like, if that's wrong, there's nothing in my mind that's ever been left to go to. So what's left? It's just chaos. And they also know that if they take any more steps in the wrong direction, they're going to pay hell for it from other people. Could you give a word or two about what you would say to somebody that's in that hardest part of it?
listen to your heart. I think, yeah, it is going to be hard no matter what you do, but life on the other side of things can be so much more peaceful and happy, and yeah, the constraints of it all. The journey out, the healing is hell, and it's going to be a really hard stretch, but yeah, you will find your way back to the sunlight eventually.
Hmm.
It's just a matter of getting, and yeah, that's what I tell people who are thinking of leaving or as they're leaving. I'm like, this is going to be a really tough stretch as everything falls apart for you, but you will find your happiness again.
Hmm. Well said. Yeah, and even things like getting into counseling as it's appropriate, and
Yeah.
certainly building up your community. You do
That's
eventually
the
find.
biggest.
Yeah, sorry.
Find community, find people that can help heal you and help support you. And I think in circles like this, when you're so used to so much toxicity, it's hard to find healthy community. But try to find whether it's a church or somebody in the community that is more healthy,
Yeah,
like
makes
an
such a
in
difference.
between church type of thing. For the people who need that bridge, yeah, find somebody who will surround you and give you that support.
Hmm. Well
Mhm.
said. Well, I know I've asked you a lot of questions. Was there anything you wanted to add before we wrap up today?
Yeah, so I think I had insinuated I was gonna come back to something about stockings, and I forgot to tell that story.
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, so and that was also in the last year, and I had been out in Germany. I think this was part of the leader's plan of getting me ready for the guy he wanted me married to after breaking my heart with everything else, and just yeah, he was pushing me to the guy he wanted me with. And part of that was by breaking me in other ways as well. So I remember one of the sisters' meetings having been told that we shouldn't be wearing taupe or beige stockings because they look too much like legs, like flesh color, and that tempted men. If you could ever see our stockings, because our skirts went down to our ankles and we wore shoes all the time. But so you were supposed to wear off black so that it was not like flesh. So that's what I did. I always strictly bought off black stockings. Anyway, so we were at this meeting in Germany, and the leader approaches me just before a service and said, "So it has been brought to my attention that you are wearing off black stockings." I'm like, "Yes." He's like, "Yeah, you're not supposed to." I'm like, "What?" "No, you're supposed to wear beige or taupe." I'm like, "No, but I strictly remember being told that we weren't supposed to wear beige or taupe because it showed the flesh color. We were supposed to wear it." And he's like, "Nope. It's either taupe or black if you have a conviction for like strict black, but otherwise taupe." I'm like, "I- okay, fine, whatever." I think this might have been more of a test of loyalty and whether I would break. And so this is before a service. And I am thinking at that point, who has actually seen my stockings? Who has reported this? Why is this being talked about? And there was nothing I could do about it at that point, so I had to get through the service, humiliated that I was wearing the wrong color of stockings. And then that evening, I got back to the place I was staying at, and the local pastor's wife came up to me and she's like, "So it has been noticed that you have been wearing off black stockings." I'm like, I know, Brother Danny already told me." And she had a package of taupe stockings that she then gave to me to wear. And I'm like, so yeah, that was just, there's a few of those events that stick out in my head. And that was one of the ones that did not make any sense at all. But
That's crazy. Oh my goodness.
yeah.
It's a truly amazing the depths to which like religion can just mess with your mind on so many levels. And I know it's like that's like them doing it to us, but it's like looking at religion as a concept as if it's a virus, and what it
Mhm.
does to us collectively, it can screw with us so bad. And that's another reason to, in my opinion, to get involved in the fight, to say we need to try to end mythology in our culture, because it's like you think, we think to ourselves, these are the weirdos, these are the fringe. Some of those people might be on our Supreme Court. Some of those people might be in the highest level of the White House or Congress. It's like these aren't fringe people. Some of these
They
people are right
aren't.
there at the top, and it's like this isn't games. This isn't like somebody that everyone else is going to be able to see. They're going to work their way up, and they're going to be thinking these same thoughts, and it's like, oh my gosh, like this is really scary. And but it's apart from the scary factor, it just blows me away that we are capable of this bizarre stuff. And I joke about this a lot, but like when you look back at what we believed as Christians and what we did, the idea of thinking that circumcision was a good thing, that genital mutilation was normal, and then even the Lord's table, the Eucharist, like you really thought that pretending to eat a dead man's body and drinking his blood was not weird? I'm like, that is so freaking weird. But when you're in it, you're in it. You're like, if everyone's
It
like, no,
feels
this is good.
normal. Or
Yeah.
some of these Bible stories are just like, "What?"
Yeah.
Like, yeah, telling my kids about some of them now, I'm like, "Oh,
Yeah.
ooh, yeah."
Judges where they're cutting up people and Elisha and the bear. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. Well,
Yeah.
I just want to say, you're definitely, your story is so powerful. I love that you've been sharing it. I love that you're continuing to share it. I'm honored that you shared it here with us today. This has been awesome. You're a great storyteller, and you really make amazing points and insights that I think are going to help a lot of people as they listen to this. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being, who you are. Thank you. I'm so glad that you got out. That's the main point. I'm so glad you escaped. But thank you for who you are and for what you are doing. And I hope you keep doing it. We need your voice in the community. But thank you so much, Gloria. It's been great to hear your story and great to get to know you.
Thanks, Tim. It was fantastic. Have a
Awesome.
great day.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.